and I'm very glad to be here, especially this is one day after yesterday, whether you know it or not, was the International Day of Remembrance of the victims of slavery in the transatlantic slave trade, March 25th. And it was actually a couple of decades ago that we launched the Harriet Tubman Institute at York University on that very day as a day of remembrance. So therefore, I'm really very pleased to be here because the learning process has to continue. And I'm going to say some things probably here today that might surprise you, that might go against a certain type of a vision of where we are in terms of the reconstruction of the history of people who had the great indignity of having to serve a period of slavery in their lives. And a very important concept was introduced before I started talking, which I appreciate, which is the Atlantic world. Well, I'm going to tell you some things about the Atlantic world that may surprise you, even though we are all, in one level or another, we're experts in areas related to Islam and related to the study of slavery in the Americas, and we know the wonderful work here that's being done on biography and on the preparation of manuscripts that have survived, that are historic national treasures of this country, and also are actually a reminder that Islam has been a religion of the world for a long, long time, and that we need to have an approach to understanding the history of Islam in the same way that we have to have an understanding of the history of Europe. It has to be balanced, because that's what history is all about. And let me start with something that may seem very, very commonplace, especially to people in this room. Islam was around West Africa for over 1,000 years. Islam is not a foreign religion in Africa. It's an indigenous religion. And yet so much of the African historiography that has been written and that has been published has overlooked that fact. And that includes even specialists of Africa, where there has not, in my opinion, after several decades of working on the subject, not enough of an appreciation of that very fact. And I hope in a small way at least, that what my talk today will help to correct some of the, what I consider to be some of the errors of interpretation about the African past and about the role of Islam in Africa, and indeed about slavery. So we don't have to worry about demonstrating to you the importance of Islam in West Africa in particular, which is what I'm focusing on. It's not the only part of Africa where Islam was important, but it's the part that is my own area of research. And it leads directly into the whole issue of biographies, which I will be getting into. What we have to recognize is that Islam, being so ancient in African history, sets the stage. It reminds me of one thing that I'm continuously correcting colleagues who want me to comment on their writing and so on, and they make statements such as, well, when in 18th century, when Islam began to get really strong, No, 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 no. Islam was very strong and had been for centuries and centuries. It's that it changed. Changes happen. They happen. This is what we study in history. We study those changes. But the change that happened in the 18th century was not a change that led to an increase of Islamization. No, no. It was a jihad movement that sought to transform what was going on in West Africa in a new way. And it was a new way that interconnected with the rest of the world in a global way. And so it's something that we need to know about. In a recent book that I published on jihad in West Africa during the Age of Revolution, I tried to show that the events in West Africa were happening exactly at the same time as a much better known age of revolutions was shaking Europe and the Americas in particular. Unrelated in any obvious kinds of ways, these two movements, but they happened at the same time. And this is very important because I've found on other occasions people want to say that what I just said was that the jihad movement in West Africa started the Age of Revolutions, or the Age of Revolutions somehow started, and I'm not saying that. I'm saying that we have two separate global movements that are happening at the same time, that we have to understand both of them. We have to understand why they're different, what's similar about them, and we have to understand that this is part of African history. As we all know, Africa is not a country. But too often with our students, with the general public, people speak of Africa as if it's a country. It is not a country. And the Islamic areas of West Africa are one part of Africa. It's the one that I'm focusing on. I don't want you to also go away and say, well, Lovejoy said this about South Africa, because I'm not talking about South Africa. It's a different Africa. But West Africa and the importance of Islam is the topic that I'm really addressing. And I want to focus specifically on the last quarter of the 18th century into the 19th century. That is the same period as the Age of Revolutions in Europe and the Americas. But what's different, if I can get this going, probably have to go back in. Here, what I want to show you in my opening slide is I have 4 images that are intended to demonstrate the vitality and the nature of Islamic rule and the Islamic government in the period that I'm talking about. In the lower left here, what you see is something that you're all studying. Are Arabic manuscripts that are indigenous, that are from West Africa, that are amazing pieces of art in themselves just because of the calligraphy and the absolutely essential dimension of understanding about Islam is the importance of the Arabic language. In the middle here we have the type of military might that existed in West Africa on the eve of what would call the European conquest of Africa and the takeover particularly of the Muslim regions, what I'm interested in. And you can understand historically why that happened just by looking at this picture. Because this picture, this is a soldier, it's a Kanembu, a warrior from the 1820s who's wearing chain metal. He's wearing his protection for the horse, for himself. He's a soldier. But you know, it doesn't take much technology to knock this guy off his horse. And that's what happened in the 19th century with the European conquest. It was a temporary moment in history where European firepower was infinitely stronger and better than anywhere else, and they could do anything they wanted. And we can see how in 100 years, how that's turned around, and the people that everything was being done to can turn around and do it themselves to everybody else. So it was a moment in history. On my far left, your far right, you see how Muslims were dressed. This is a drawing from Ashanti in the 19th century, which isn't even normally considered to be a Muslim state, but nonetheless has a Muslim chancery, it has a Muslim merchant population, and indeed is part of the Islamic world in that sense. And above that is a picture of the mosque in Kano city that was torn down in the 1930s, unfortunately. But this is the historic central mosque of Kano, been replaced by a more modern looking building since then. But again, showing the antiquity, because this mosque goes back to the Middle Ages in terms of when it was built originally, and obviously kept up in repairs until it was destroyed in the 1930s. So this is the Islamic context, but what I want you to also realize, as you also know from your studies here at Duke, is that manuscripts made it into the diaspora. This is a text written by Mohammad Gagarabakwa, written in Jamaica in about 1820. It's actually two books in one. It was mislabeled by Baptist missionaries as portions of the Quran, which it is not. And therefore, because it was labeled portions of the Quran, I believe, is the reason why scholars ignored it for so long, because they just thought it was portions of the Quran, until we actually started looking at it and realized that while there are quotations, and not usually from the Quran, but from various Muslim scholars through the ages, that we realized that we were actually dealing with something else. It didn't have a name, so we called it the Kitab al-Salah, because really it's two books about praying. What happens if you do pray? What happens if you don't pray? How do you pray at a wedding? How do you pray at a funeral? How do you do all of these things? And in the middle, Mohammad Gagarabakwa writes in the middle, or in between the two books, in effect. He writes a very poignant statement. He says, "I'm writing this down because I'm losing my memory." Because he doesn't have access to these books. He doesn't have access to the infrastructure that sustains Islam. And yet this man, Mohammad Gagarabakwa in Jamaica, living on the coffee plantation from 1777 until his death in 1865, this man, isolated from the Islamic world, nonetheless maintained relations with other Muslims by writing letters to them in Arabic, telling them in his letter, when you write to me, use my Muslim name, don't use my Christian name. He had a network within Jamaica of writing and talking with other Muslims. This isn't supposed to happen. This was not the way it was supposed to be. People are supposed to be isolated. supposed to have no connection with the religion. On the basis of my work in Jamaica, I believe Mohammad Gagarabakwa was the head of a Muslim community of 1,000 people in Manchester Parish. They all hid themselves because they went to the Moravian church. But they hid themselves because that's one thing that they had learned in West Africa in being a Muslim, that if you get into the hands of Christians, you hide. You don't reveal who you are. You don't give up your faith. You don't syncretize, to use a later scholarly term that's meant to be mixing of religion. You don't mix Islam. You understand it better and better and better, but you don't mix it. And what do I mean by that? It means that if you can't pray because it's dangerous, because somebody might really beat you up because they think you're doing something weird, then you don't let them see you pray. You don't let them see you, you don't let them see you taking part in the month of Ramadan. Mohammad Gagarabakwa wrote about that in 1819 in one of his, he's reported as saying that, oh, Ramadan was easy. We just told our masters that we were sick and we couldn't eat for 1 month. And that's how they did it. You imagine the suffering, and you can imagine the difficulties of maintaining that type of religious belief and carrying it forward. They sent their children to Moravian schools. Why? Because they couldn't send them to Quranic schools. But they still thought you have to have education. And that's what they were doing. So, Mohammad Gagarabakwa is very important historically, because it allows us to appreciate that what we're talking about in West Africa in terms of Islam, and talking about this in terms of the African diaspora and so on, is we're talking about two major concentrations of Muslims. And they're somewhat different. And for African historians, they're extremely different. In the first hand, there is the Muslims that dominated Senegambia and the Western Sudan or the Western Savannah, if we don't want to use the word Sudan anymore, for the same reason we don't want to use the word slave anymore, because it's pejorative. This has implications behind it that we don't want. So the Western Savannah, Senegambia, this is Mali, Guinea-Conakry, this is Gambia and Senegal. This is one focus, and Mauritania. This is one focus of the Islamic world in West Africa. Dominated by one language, Malinke, and variations of one language. So that you're seeing what? You're not seeing an Africa filled with 150 tribes. You're seeing an Africa where everybody can communicate together because there's one common language, plus there's other languages too, if you don't want people to know what you're talking about. So there's one myth that has to go right out the window, is that people can't communicate in Africa. Well, they could, because they could use this one commercial language, a language that covered this large area, and it was not difficult at all ever to find someone you can talk to if you needed to, so it was the language. And the second one is the focus on the Hausa-speaking region of what's now northern Nigeria and southern Niger, where you have another language over a huge area, which is a common language, and whatever other languages people speak, they also speak some Hausa. So that you have two big cultural groups centered on Islam that have common languages over this very, very large area. So communication is easy, not difficult. And here I show what is happening in the extreme western part of Africa during the period, and particularly in the 18th century, which is where the jihad movement begins. I guess my mouse doesn't show up on there. Okay, it won't. So the jihad movement began in the 1680s and into the 1690s. And that first, as in often in great movements of this type, the earliest impetus towards jihad and towards a religious war that was going to transform most of West Africa over the next 100 and 150 years was not a success, the first attempt. But in the 1690s, the small state of Fouta Bandou on the Senegal River transformed itself, and it was successful. And then following that, the jihad movement erupted in the Fouta Djallon highlands in what's now Guinea. And after that, in Fouta Toro, also on the Senegal River. So although these early jihads were not connected geographically, they were connected in an intellectual way. They were connected in a dedication to a transformation of society based on a regenerated Islamic faith. And what were the main concerns of this early movement, which is going to mushroom after the 18th century? Well, the early concerns were several. One is that the existing political leadership of most of the states of West Africa were corrupt. They enslaved Muslims, they stole money, they drank, they organized armies that went around and terrorized people. They didn't live according to the Sharia, and therefore they had to be overthrown. So there's number one. Number two was, one of the major problems is that people who were born as freeborn Muslims were being enslaved. Now, Islam has a lot to say about slavery, but the one most important thing is you do not enslave a freeborn Muslim. It cannot be done. And it was being done. And it was being done, and it was being done in a way that some of the people that were being enslaved were being sold to Christians and were being sold across the Atlantic Ocean. So that a second reaction to the corruption of society after the fact that governments were not behaving in the best interests of governing the people was the fact that freeborn Muslims were being enslaved. And the third factor was that they were actually being sold to non-Muslims, which was against the law. Why? Slavery wasn't against the law, but selling a freeborn Muslim was. And there's a big twist here between how slavery was perceived in the Americas and how slavery was perceived in the Islamic world. In the Americas, if someone said you were a slave and you were black, you had to prove that you weren't. You had to prove, the burden of proof was on you. In Islam, just the opposite. If I say you're my slave, I've got to prove that you are a slave. You don't have to prove to me that you're not or you are. I, the master, have to prove that what I'm telling is the truth. It's a complete flip in terms of justification, in terms of legitimacy. It does not mean, and this is very important, to go away from my talk and say something that I didn't say. I am not saying that Islam was against slavery. It was not. And very definitely, it was not. And I'm not saying, as with all slavery, and let's make this very clear, it's a crime against humanity. It's always been a crime against humanity. And you can't then turn around and say, oh, this slavery was better than that slavery. No, no, no. One crime is better than another crime? No, it's a crime. We have to accept that, we have to deal with it, and then we have to take the consequences of it and try to figure out how we're going to get through the terrible situation we are in the world where slavery equals racism. And it's the racism we got to get rid of, because slavery, except for the modern forms which are terrible and have to be dealt with in a criminal way, because they can be, but except for that, slavery is an evil. And we shouldn't be ashamed. We all come from, this is our background, historically. Slavery was everywhere. And one of the biggest stories in humankind is getting rid of it. So, these are the guys that you'll recognize. They all come from that the western Savannah, Senegambia region that I talk about. They all come from this first phase of the jihad movement. These are all guys who come from Fouta Toro or Fouta Jalon or Fouta Bandou. They're heroes. They made it to the Americas. They demonstrated that Islam could survive and would. And they lived their lives out, and they made an impression upon racist people around them who were subjecting them to slavery, and they rose above it. They even convinced in meaningful ways that some of the individuals that they worked like Blount and these people, they convinced them that, you know, there's part of the world we don't know anything about, and we want to know more about it. And isn't it amazing that these people can have this religion and they survived and they came all over here? And this was the first generation. And they stand out. And they're amazing. Some of them you won't know as well. This man, Mohammad Gagarabakwa, is a man who came from actually the transitional zone between the Hausa area and the far western Sudan. Came from a place called Jugu in what's now northern Benin. As you can gather from his name, he was a Muslim. His first name, Muhammad. He's not the oldest son in his family. He was he had an older brother, so he was not named Muhammad because he was the firstborn male. He was named Muhammad because it was the name of his mother's father. And because it was the name of his mother's father, nobody in the family could ever call him Muhammad, because out of respect for the grandfather, you can't call a younger child by that same name, and so therefore he had to have two nicknames. He had, in his case, two nicknames. He had a nickname Gardo, and he had a nickname Bakwakwa. It's taken me almost... Gardo is easy. Gardo is a Hausa term, also a Dembe term, for the name of a nickname for a child is born after twins. And Mohammad Gagarabakwa says in his autobiography that he was indeed born after twins, although he does not explain that his middle nickname was a name that was given to a child who was born after twins. So that was rather nice that he explained it, but without explaining it. And so therefore that just meant that you had to know a little bit of Hausa and had to have a network that could find out what these names might be. Bakwakwa was more difficult, although when I finally found out what it meant, I couldn't stop my colleagues in the room from laughing at me. They just went into hysterical laughter because Lovejoy just his house, it was so bad that he didn't realize what Bakwakwa meant, and why a mother would call a baby Bakwakwa. Well, Bakwakwa means Bakwakwa means he wasn't inquisitive. As a child, his mother always said, "You are a mummy's boy. You know, you're always around me, you don't look at anybody else, you don't care about anything else, you have no interest in anything else except your mother." That's what his mother was telling him all the time, "Oh, my little Bakwakwa," you know. And this time, and here is this, you know, foreign white guy coming in and saying, "What does this mean?" And then all these other guys who know what it means, laughing their heads off because I never understood. Anyway, I understand now. So he had two Hausa nicknames, and he was named after his mother's father. So we actually, just from his name alone, look what you can find out. It's amazing. And it's the same with everyone, too. Just to complete the Bakwakwa story, well, it's not complete, it's a book. It's being considered for publication. Many years ago with Robin Law, I published an annotated text of Bakwakwa's autobiography, which was a great project, except as the years, you know, the one thing about doing biography is the people that you become interested in, they never die. They never leave you. They're there. They're always there. They keep coming back. The Bakwakwa part of that story was this was only about 3 years ago, just before the pandemic. And I've been working on this guy for decades. And it was only then that that piece of the puzzle fell into place. So I've written a book. It's another one that's coming out. This guy, Ali Asami Gazarmo, he's something that we all should know about. I know our focus in this room and is diaspora. But this guy was in diaspora. He just never left Africa. You know, he wrote 2 books in Kanuri. 2 books. He wrote a grammar, and he wrote a long history of his own life and all kinds of things. And what happened to him is he was enslaved in the jihad, the eastern one, and he ended up as being a slave in a royal household in Oyo for several years before 1817. And in 1817, his masters sold him because he didn't trust him anymore, because 1817 was the year that the Muslim uprising occurred in Ilorin against the Oyo state. And it was at that point that the Oyo aristocracy realized that they, a bit late, they realized they had a real problem, because they had on their hands a jihad movement right within the state of Oyo. And for those of you who are African historians, you may think that I'm venturing into an area of dispute, because a lot of the times the Yoruba wars are not considered to have much to do with the jihad, but in my opinion, the Yoruba wars came about because of the jihad. And the Yoruba state of Oyo collapsed because of the jihad. And it was men like this that in 1817 his master said, "We got to get rid of him," and sold him to the coast so that he could put on a ship and be taken to Brazil. Well, the British Navy happened to catch that ship, so our hero ended up in Sierra Leone. And he even changed his name to Thomas Hardy. Although I have serious doubts, as I've already expressed, that when someone says they converted from Islam to Christianity, I'm really skeptical. I'm really skeptical about that. I mean, one of the things that the children are learning in West Africa in Quranic school is that if you get yourself in a difficult situation and you have to pretend to be a Christian, don't hesitate. Do it. Stay alive. Keep your faith. And it's hard with that type of ideology, in a sense, to talk about conversion. No. So Ali Asami wrote 2 books, just unbelievable. And he's not a national hero in Nigeria. And he should be. Or this guy, who we're going to hear a lot about over the next little while, Mohammad Nicholas Saeed. He actually called himself Nicholas Saeed in the last parts of his life. So I suppose that's the name we really should be calling him, not by his original Muslim name. But he won't necessarily be in your canon either, because when he was enslaved, he was taken across the Sahara, not the Atlantic. He was taken across the Atlantic, across the Sahara in the early 1850s. He ended up being a slave in a royal household in Istanbul. He was given away to a Russian diplomat who went on to become the commander-in-chief of the Russian army in Crimea. And just to bring these things up to date in terms of what's going on in the world today. Nicholas Saeed became converted to Russian Orthodoxy by force in Latvia during this period when he was taken to Russia. He then ended up going along with as a valet because slavery was no longer legal in Russia, so technically he was free. Not even technically, he legally was free. And he went on to be a valet for wealthy aristocratic Russians who traveled all over Western Europe. When he finally made the decision that he wanted to go home, because where he came from was Borno, his father was a slave general. He had his title because he was a slave, and he was the leader of one of the major contingent of the Kanuri army, of the army of Borno. But he was also a boy at the time he was enslaved, and like a lot of boys who were a teenager, he didn't listen to his mother. His mother told him not to go hunting. He went hunting anyway, and he got kidnapped. And then he got sent across the Sahara. And then he ended up in Russia. Then he ended up in Western Europe. And then in Western Europe, he decided that he was going to go home and find his mother. But at the last moment, he got a good job offer from a Dutch aristocrat who was actually a phony. And the Dutch aristocrat who married a British woman went on their honeymoon, and they took our guy as their valet, and they crossed the Atlantic. They even went to Canada and went to the United States too, of course. They went to the Caribbean. He came back, and his employers dumped him in Ottawa. Well, actually not in Ottawa, in Almar, which is across the river, the Hull River from Ottawa. It almost became you almost would have known where it was, because it almost became the Canadian national capital, but instead Ottawa did, so you know where Ottawa is and you don't know where Almar is. So anyway, they're on the opposite sides of the river. And so being abandoned in Canada like that without any money, and all he had was his Turkish uniform, you know. In the 19th century they made them wear these little so they look like exotic, and therefore you could hire them as your valet, and it looked like as if you really had a lot of money, which apparently his employers ran out of because they left him. And he then made his way to Detroit, where, believe it or not, he ran into a minister in a church there that he had met in the Adriatic Sea on his way to Russia. Can you believe this? Anyway, it did. It happened. And from there, he got on a train and he went to Boston because he enlisted in the 35th All-Black Regiment and was fought in the Civil War. He's a free black. He didn't cross the Atlantic because of slavery. Well, maybe in a distant past there's a connection, yes, but he didn't cross the Atlantic as a slave. He got here and he fought in the Civil War. He became a sergeant. This is him as a sergeant. He wrote a little autobiographical sketch in the Atlantic Monthly, of all things, in 1867 about his life. And then he published his autobiography in Memphis, Tennessee in 1873. And he's not known about what had happened. He didn't go back to Africa. No, he stayed in Charleston. He got involved with the Freedmen's Bureau in registering voters. We even have his bank account in Tallahassee, Florida, where he had a bank account because of his connection with the Freedmen's Bureau. He went on and he founded schools in Alabama and Georgia. He stayed in the United States during the Reconstruction period. And the last we hear of him is, we think we hear of him, is he's in jail because, like a lot of intellectual blacks at that time, of course the Ku Klux Klan went after anybody who had an education, and he ended up working for the Tennessee gas company, coal company, working in their mines that were actually in Alabama and weren't even in Tennessee. And that's the last we hear of him, and we just assume that he died in jail, as a lot of people did. So my second and last part, because I'm moving along here, is what happens in the Central Sudan and the interior of the Bight of Benin, which is the other half of the story of the jihad beginning in Senegambia. This is what the area looked at the same time that the jihad movement is starting and really taking off in the Senegambia region. This is the area that it looks like what's going on in what's now Nigeria and neighboring countries. No jihad. Oyo is the dominant state. Borno is very large, and Ashanti is about the same size as it was in the other picture. And that's what happens. It's a complete revolution that overthrows virtually all of the established governments in this area, as the same thing that happened in the Western Sudan, and that a very militant form of Islam under the banner of jihad takes over. And again, just as with the areas to the west, one of the deciding factors was that free-born Muslims were being enslaved and being sold to Christians. And this could not be allowed to happen, and this is one of the ultimate examples of a corrupt government that allows that to happen. And so this is what happened internally. Now, what is this? How does this affect the Atlantic world, which I started with? You see, because this shaped the Atlantic world. This is a part of Africa that took itself out of the Atlantic world, and that's the way it shaped it. And this is the part that you may or may not, but I urge you to read my book, and I also urge you to think through a little bit of the logic here. We are rightly glorifying and we are rightly studying Muslims that came to North America and came to the Americas and survived. And we are rightly showing that how some of them had unbelievable educations. Now, Bakwa was at one end of that scale. He was a terrible student. We have our other examples who wrote extensively in Arabic. So we have a range, just as we did in West Africa. If you weren't very good at Arabic, your parents didn't make sure that you went on to become an Islamic scholar. They put you in trade or something else. They didn't do that. But the one child who was really brilliant in Arabic, that's the one who goes into and becomes a cleric and becomes a leader in the community sense. So I'm arguing that our efforts to see Africa as a country and the enormous numbers of people that were enslaved and sent to the Americas, a figure that now is closer to 13 million than 12.7 million, as the numbers keep going up, that the numbers that went to the Islamic world, that the numbers that went into the Indian Ocean are enormous. This is a gigantic migration that has differences and similarities, but which we have to study. But in the case of the West Africa, what the Muslim movement did, the jihad movement did in West Africa, is it took its area out of the slave trade. And I'm arguing that there's no more than maximum of 5% of all of the enslaved Africans that went to the Americas were Muslim, who came from Muslim areas. 5%. Tiny. Tiny. From the closest part of Africa to the Americas. Tiny. At a time, because of the jihad movement, and you'll have to see my arguments on this, at a time when the jihad movement, by 1850, the jihad states of West Africa had more enslaved people than all of the Americas had ever, at any point in time, in total. Now let that sink in. West Africa took itself out of the Atlantic slave trade and put itself into the African slave trade in a way that developed very, very progressive Muslim states, despite the reliance on slavery, growing what, you might ask? Cotton, just like the American South. Producing textiles, just like the Western world. Clothing all of West Africa, despite imports from Europe and India. So that you see developments, you see changes going on in West Africa that are absolutely monumental, that are not it doesn't come in as a small tail wagging the dog of the slave trade. It comes in as a part of the world that erroneously invested extensively in slavery in terms of development and so on, and in the end that was its downfall because of what Europeans were able to do at the end of the 19th century. So they shaped the Atlantic world by reducing the number of people that actually came from West Africa in general. And we've known this for some time, that increasingly more and more enslaved Africans came from West Central Africa, Southeast Asia, from the Igbo areas that had nothing to do with Islam. So that you see that how this balances out in terms of the numbers of people, why it happens, where it happens, and the consequences. Now, my last point is I haven't shown you any women. Didn't show you any women. And this is one of the most startling things, because Muslims did go to the Americas enslaved. We know that. We have proof. We have examples. But no women. No women. Last thing a Muslim slave trader would ever want to do is sell a woman to a non-Muslim. No. The only cases that I have, and I've been working on collecting a database called Freedom Narratives, where we are documenting as many cases of individuals who suffered from slavery but who were born in West Africa and now were actually born anywhere in Africa. And we're looking, we're collecting biographical information. We expect in the end we're going to have 100 to 200,000 cases of people that will be able to take all these little micro histories and put all these micro histories together, and it'll be a macro history. The one thing you don't, I only have one example where I know where there's a Muslim woman who was enslaved, and because she was a concubine and she was accused of murdering her master. So I guess there was a woman you could sell to a Christian, because she might murder her Christian master. You never know. That's the only example. It's astonishing. How do they enforce this? How did this happen? No women. Fewer and fewer Muslim men that are going into diaspora. How do they manage this? And my answer to that is this jihad movement. And this transformation that occurred in West Africa wasn't going to be the last of the transformation. Those transformations have continued to the present. Continue to the present. And so therefore, once you realize that, perhaps it's not as difficult to understand how these kinds of transformations could also happen in the past. And so what I hope that does in terms of our appreciation of the scholars who unfortunately were brought to the Americas, but fortunately didn't let their scholarship die, and maintained it so that we can actually go back and find these individuals and give them the respect that they deserve, and help us to individualize the slave trade. To take the people that were supposed to have been made invisible and find them, make it so that we can see them and understand them as people, as human beings, not as slaves, as human beings. And in all of the cases that we're talking about, and the work that's being done here at Duke, that's exactly, in my opinion, what you're doing, is you're giving the life back to these people who have been denied the right of their own personalities, and have been told that they're nothing more than a commodity, like a slave, that you can buy and sell like a horse. No, we got to bring this back. And it's only then that we begin to start, attacking the myths that we have about a whole range of subjects, not just this one, about that whole ugly history of slavery, and how we have to find ways today to disentangle slavery and racism. The slavery part has been disentangled. It's a crime against humanity in the past. The racism is a crime against humanity in the present. We've got to disentangle those two things so that we can deal with the real problem today, which is the racism. Thank you.
Wow.